Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recover and avoiding corporate mortality events. Joining us today is Doug Chia. Doug is currently the owner and president of Soundboard Governance LLC and a fellow at the Rutgers Center for Corporate Law and Governance. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks so much for having me.
Can you share a little bit more about yourself and your journey to where you are today?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer by training. I was a securities lawyer, and I worked in New York and Hong Kong doing securities transactions. And then at some point, I decided to go in-house, and I went in-house to Tyco International, which at the time was undergoing a lot of changes and revamping in the wake of scandals and the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. A little while later, I moved to Johnson & Johnson and eventually became their corporate secretary and dealt with everything related to the board, with the securities filings and the governance of the various subsidiaries around the world. A few years ago, about 5 years ago, I moved to the conference board to become the executive director of the ESG Center. And there I was really a subject matter expert and thought leader for the conference board, which is a think tank. 2 years ago, I decided to go off on my own and create Soundboard Governance, which is my own consulting practice for corporate governance. And I also teach at the Rutgers Law School.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're going to be talking about corporate governance today, which we were talking about a little bit on our last episode, but we're going to go deeper into kind of the problems. So, give me some examples of organizations that have failed with this corporate governance and just kind of set up for why this is so important.
Well, I think the high profile ones, I think everybody's read about. Boeing probably being the most recent in terms of the MAX jet and the disasters around that, and what the board did or did not do in the wake of that. A few years ago, Wells Fargo was the one that was on the front pages for the fake accounts. Also, the board, when did they know? What did they know? And what did they know? When did they know it? Another case that does not involve a public company but is very much in the public eye is Theranos. And there you also had a board where, why did they not find out or ask the right questions about what was going on at the company and whether the product that the management was producing was real or worked or anything like that. And, what kind of expertise was on the board? Were the right people even on the board?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that and about how boards get made up and even just their responsibility. Because a lot of us who maybe don't have a lot of board interaction, we hear about, oh, we got to go present the results to the board, or we have to go present, project status. And all of that sounds very, sterile, right? Like there's no, it doesn't sound like we're talking about culture or what incidents have we had with sexual misconduct or things like that. But is that what actually goes to the board? What do they?
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that. And yes, management, a lot of management feels that there's kind of this us versus them mentality at times where, okay, we have to report this to the board. Frankly, if we didn't have to, we'd rather not because it's kind of a pain. But we have to do it, so let's present something, and whatever we present, it's going to look good. It's very hard for management to present all of the good and all of the bad to the board. It's just not their natural instinct, especially when they want things and need things approved by the board. So naturally, whatever gets presented to the board is going to be either very bland or polished, and it's just the nicest, most polished rock you can present to the board. The thing looks like a diamond. And so that's, the board doesn't really have any way of knowing and trying to figure out how the information got to the board and what it looked like in, draft number 1 or number 3. And so the board can ask a lot of questions and do some probing, but it never really knows whether it's getting to the essence and whether it's seeing, all the warts.
So what should, I guess then, on both sides of the coin, should managers be doing when presenting to the board? And on the flip side, should the board be getting any more involved operationally then? Should they be dropping in on the corporate buildings and touring around them, or what do you see that works well?
Yeah, it's, this is always a tricky one in terms of the role of a director. The role of a director is not to be part of the operations. They are supposed to be there for oversight. But at the same time, people are expecting the board to understand what goes on inside the company and the company's culture. Now, showing up for meetings 6 times a year and where you never worked there and you don't have an office there, it's very hard to gauge what that's like. So they're relying on senior management, but there are those who think that the board should be using their access to the company either in a formal way or an informal way to get a feel for the day-to-day life of an employee at the different facilities. Now, obviously, these days, companies, they're very, they get big, they have multiple facilities, they might be even all over the world. And so it's hard for a director to really have their finger on the pulse. But I think talking to employees below the senior 2 levels, the 2 most senior levels, I think that's important. And the board members have to take affirmative steps to do that. Management's not going to offer that up. It's just not natural for them to do that. And so if you're only talking to the executive committee and getting reports from them and their direct reports at these 6 meetings a year, you don't stand a chance of understanding the company's culture.
Absolutely. And so what really is the board then accountable for when we talk about the problem with the 787 and some of these other things that have come to light? What is the board responsible for? Yeah.
Well, there's the legal answer, and then there's what I call the real answer. The legal answer is they're there to fulfill certain fiduciary duties, the duty of care, the duty of loyalty. And there are all kinds of court cases around, what defines that. Frankly, it is very hard for a director to fail so badly that they're held liable for something. It doesn't happen very often. And then a lot of high profile cases where, people look at the financial crisis and say, how come nobody was held directly accountable? What about those board members? And if you can't, if you couldn't find culprits at the board level in the financial crisis, then when are we ever going to find that? To me, the real answer, what I tell directors, is the court of public opinion matters a lot more these days. Sometimes I refer to this, I tell people, can you pass the Elizabeth Warren test? If you were pulled in front of a subcommittee in the Senate and Elizabeth Warren got to question you, how would you deal with that situation? Because she's going to tear you apart. I mean, that's kind of her objective. And will you be able to withstand that? Will your reputation be able to withstand that? So, the stakeholders, it's not just about the shareholders anymore. There are stakeholders like the media and the government and NGOs and employees that are watching what the directors are doing. Inevitably, the directors will get blamed if something big if something bad happens, that's really significant. They will get blamed, whether it's fair or not. And that's, kind of the point in terms of the directors really have to take more proactive steps to find stuff out and not just rely on being fed by the management.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, I guess, then crisis management. When they find themselves in this situation, what should boards be doing, and even senior leadership be doing to, lead the organization through the crisis?
Yeah, another tricky subject in terms of, does the board lead the organization through the crisis, or does it really coach management through it? Who speaks for the organization? It's going to be a very kind of fact-specific situation. Obviously, if the CEO is involved in some wrongdoing, of course, the board has to take over at that point. But if it's a crisis like COVID, where the company is hit with some unexpected event that really busts up its ability to operate, the CEO is the one who should be taking the lead, and the board is playing a supporting role. Now, the supporting role is more advisory in nature, in terms of they're almost like they're basically a board of advisors at that point, and trying to coach the CEO through the situation based on their own experience as executives from different walks of corporate life. But the directors also, the communication that goes out from the company to address these crises will reflect on the board. And so the board can't say, well, that was management's statement. That was management's ham-handed attempt at a statement to the public, and we really had nothing to do with it. That's just not going to fly. Those statements are going to represent the board, even though the chair of the board is not the one who's having the press conference.
What a lot of times in crises, the CEO might get replaced, almost like there has to be somebody to blame. How much influence does the board have over the reorganization of a company? And are they still acting as an advisor, or do they have some weight when it comes to how the organization is structured and is responding in these situations?
Well, the directors in those types of situations, they have direct control. So a lot of governance experts say that the board's job boils down to hiring and firing the CEO. You either have the right CEO in place and you keep him or her there, or you have the wrong one and you get rid of them and you find one who's going to do the job you want them to do. So in that sense, when boards are obviously skittish to fire the CEO for a whole variety of reasons, including it reflects badly on them if they chose the person recently. But yes, the board has a direct hand, or should have a direct hand, in restructurings, whether it's at the C-suite or it's the company in general, in terms of we're going to restructure the business, we're going to reallocate assets, we're going to spin off this division, we're going to acquire that. These are all things that the board really needs to be fundamentally involved in, and they're the ones who have to make the final decision on any of these things. Again, management can take these ideas to the board. The board tends to defer to management and go along with what management wants, the kind of on the assumption that management did everything to get to that conclusion. Board says, okay, well, look, we're not going to second guess you. You guys did all the homework on this. So yeah, assuming, we have confidence in you, in that you are the people in place. And so we're going to let you make the decision and we will support you on that. That's, that level of deference can get dangerous. the board really needs to be pressure testing. There's a way to support yet pressure test at the same time. The idea of trust but verify.
Absolutely. So when you look at the U.S. Focus, a lot of times we hear we have to create shareholder value. We have to create shareholder value, and you look at countries like Japan. At least this was true a few years ago. I assume still is. They seem to have a longer term focus. Is that so looking 50 years out instead of a quarter out, or at least something like that, right? So that there's more accountability to the long-term impacts. Do we see any changes like that in the States, or is it still very, I just want to make sure I make my next quarter earnings so that I can report good things out to the shareholders?
It's both. In terms of, you could say that corporate America is talking out of both sides of its mouth, but obviously, that's a broad generalization. I mean, what you do have is you have this movement, at least in terms of the rhetoric around moving away from this shareholder primacy and really factoring in other stakeholders. And when people talk about other stakeholders, it's generally the customers, the employees, and the community in which the company operates and has its facilities. In terms of how that is playing out, there's been recent developments on that in terms of very prominent organizations and captains of industry talking the talk on that kind of principle of, let's think long term, let's think of stakeholders and not just shareholders. It's hard to measure how they are doing on that front. I think today, just given where we are as a society, there's a lot of concern for employees and the workers, and are they being treated fairly? Are they being paid fairly? Especially when you compare it to people in the C-suite. And so, I think people look at that as as an indicator of, all right, is this stakeholder thing? Are people actually, is a particular company actually taking this seriously? Because if they are, then you shouldn't see them, laying off tons of people because of COVID, and they should be supporting their workers while they can't work. All of these types of things. So it's I think the tide has shifted in terms of the philosophy from the shareholder first philosophy to let's look at all of the stakeholders. But that's harder. It's a lot harder for the board to do. Some would say the board really shouldn't be in the business of trying to assess which stakeholders should come first, and corporations should stay out of trying to solve societal problems. Interesting that you mentioned Japan, because Japan, they are going through something different. They're actually coming at it from the other end, in that maybe Japanese shareholders were too long-term oriented and complacent, and need some activists with more short-term interest to come shake it up. And so in Japan, it's almost like they're doing the opposite of what we're doing.
Maybe this is too simplistic, but I guess, in my perspective, if we're taking care of the employees, right, and that's where we're focused, the employees are focused then on taking care of the customers, which then, if the customers are taken care of, the stakeholders shareholders are taken care of.
Yeah. That's a very stakeholder-oriented point of view. Mm-hmm. The company I worked for, Johnson & Johnson, had more of that type of a view, that if you take care of everything you're supposed to take care of as a business and serving your customers, then the shareholders should make out just fine at the end. We'll pay them a decent dividend, and the stock will go up, steadily, but maybe not like kind of this astronomical double-digit growth every year, but it's patient capitalism. Yeah.
So, you said something interesting there. And I guess there's a little bit of what is that C-suite compensation then, because that I guess also drives behavior. A lot of the C-suite may not make a huge base salary, but get paid in huge stock options or and so then they become a shareholder and they want to see that number go up. So what are your thoughts? Do you have thoughts around C-suite compensation and how you get that to drive the correct behavior?
Yeah, C-suite compensation, people really look at CEO compensation. That's kind of where the action's at. People ask me, do CEOs get paid too much? I say, yes, they all get paid too much. It's just to what degree. Some of them are, grossly overpaid, and others are just plain overpaid. I think that the fascination with equity linked compensation has been a really bad thing for corporate America and for our society. If you look at the wealth disparity, you can trace it to when companies just started giving a lot more stock options and less percentage of salary. What it does is it makes people focus on the stock price. Now, people say, well, that's the whole point. We want them to have the price of the stock go up. But if that's your only focus, then you're prone to do certain things just to make the stock go up, which might not be so good for the broader business or your employees. Anytime a company lays off people or cuts employee benefits, the stock goes up. And it's kind of a perverse thing going on there. I think we should move back to more cash. And part of it is that you can control that. The board can control how much cash they're giving out, how much in terms of the bonus that they're awarding. Problem with the stock is that once you award it, you have no control over how much it's worth. So, there were big controversies every time there's a market downturn, or in a market downturn, all of a sudden people are getting greater numbers of stock options to make up for the lower dollar value. And then when, the rebound happens, that stock explodes. And, people look at that and say, look, these people, it was a windfall. These people should never have gotten that many options at that price. And now they're only getting a windfall, not because of their own performance, but it's because the whole market is overperforming. So they're getting paid for stuff that they're really not, they're not causing. But the shareholders want alignment of interest. They want the directors and the board and the CEOs to have skin in the game. So there are some shareholders out there who say that, the CEO should get paid only in stock so that they are fully aligned with the interests of the shareholders. And, it's not a crazy proposition. It's just, does that lead to good outcomes?
Right. Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned the disparity of compensation, and you'll hear people say, well, the employee at McDonald's makes $15 an hour, but the CEO makes, I don't know McDonald's, but I'm sure it's a huge number. And my initial reaction to that is, yeah, but the employee, one, that skill set's not in high demand. Right. So you could switch that person out. And two, they get to punch out and be done. Right. The CEO doesn't ever get to punch out. I mean, how many CEOs have you worked with that they're supposed to be on vacation, but they're taking emergency calls, while their family's out swimming and stuff. So it's a huge sacrifice, almost like the sport, people in sports. Right. They get paid a lot of money because they work for a short time, they do a lot of sacrifice. But on the other side, I know like the CEO of Disney makes tons of money. So how do we determine like what's fair there? Because, you know, it's definitely different inputs that is, you know, a frontline worker is putting in versus a CEO.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know, we need to take care of our people.
Yeah, it's, you know, people have different ways of looking at what's quote unquote fair in terms of CEO pay. You know, just kind of looking at fair on a kind of a parity basis compared to just, you know, your average person, it looks grossly unfair. I mean, there's just no way to, you know, to justify it. But when, you know, people say, look, the company grew by this much under the CEO's watch, and the CEO, you know, caused a lot of that, shouldn't they get a cut, you know, their fair share of that? You know, shouldn't they get like 1% of whatever the growth was? And then you're talking about huge numbers. And so it really depends on what your definition of fair is. But I think, you know, in this country today, there's, you know, there's a lot of discussion around this. I think some of the justification for high CEO pay, I just don't buy it. In terms of, well, if we don't pay this person this much, they're going to leave and go somewhere else. I just don't think that there's a real market where CEOs are essentially interchangeable, and we can, you know, it's like like a basketball team or something. It's like, okay, we need now, you know, we need a guy who's going to score 30 points a game. Let's go get him. Let's go get him from another team. A CEO that's successful at one company is not necessarily going to be successful at another. And in general, the CEOs that do well tend to be the ones that get promoted from within, the ones that grew up in the company, as opposed to the superstars that people try to headhunt for. So it's kind of, you know, people make the comparison to athletes, but it's sometimes it's questionable. I mean, it's also questionable how much the athletes get paid, and actors and all of those folks. But, you know, is there a true market for CEOs where you can say, look, that is the going rate for a CEO for a company of that size in that industry? I'm not sure it, you know, it really, you know, it really boils down to that. I think that's overstated.
So how would you solve that then, or take steps to solve it? In that, you know, obviously there's a little bit of game theory there where, you know, if I'm a director of you know, of Coke, you know, Coca-Cola bottling company, I'm not going to go change how I'm compensating CEOs because maybe Pepsi goes steal them from me or something like that, right? So it's like, it's a lot of risk for one company to make a change. So how would you approach that then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about the talent pipeline. You know, it's grooming people from the inside and treating them well and developing them well, so that they, you know, they're going to have a good long career there. And then by the time, you know, so at any given point, you should have, you know, a bench of people who either could take over as the CEO or are being groomed to do that. Any company where the CEO, you know, quits or dies or whatever, is poached, and they look around, they're like, oh my God, wait, there's no one else who can run the company. I mean, the board has failed at that point. You know, someone, you know, they relied too heavily on this one individual, and they did not groom another person, or the people that they groomed left. You know, it's really the people who are on the way up. They're the ones who are, you know, you're most at risk of having poached from under you rather than your own CEO. So and you know, people look at the CEO pay and how much that is, not compared to the average person, but to the people right underneath them, and you know, the next couple levels. So if you have a CEO that's paid over 3 times what the next highest executive is paid. Question whether is that person really, worth that much, or could one of these other folks take over? Um, and that the board has to be on top of succession planning. There's the emergency succession plan, and then there's the long-term succession plan, and the board should be thinking about that all the time. Not one of these, well, we're kind of ways away from that. We don't really, we've got a couple years before we have to think of that. It's like, no, you don't. The average tenure of a CEO these days is like 5 to 7 years. So you gotta be prepared for it before it comes.
Do you find, I guess if you take that compensation through, well, so I'm trying to real time connect two concepts here. So one concept is CEO burnout, right? So they take on a lot, they have a lot of responsibility, they get burned out, they may be with a company a short amount of time and move on, right? And then you mentioned CEOs getting paid, 3 times as much as kind of the next layer down. Is there anything to say that if we reduce the CEO's pay and invested in having more people in that support role, right, supporting the CEO, could we see less CEO burnout?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, the job of the CEO is very difficult. These people are not getting paid to do nothing. And like you said, they're always on call. They're in the hot seat. The investors are constantly breathing down their necks to produce, and grow EPS on a quarterly basis and all that stuff. So, but yeah, I think there is a good argument for having more of this team approach to running the corporation, as opposed to such focus on one individual. For some reason, yeah, the company and the CEO become synonymous, and nobody even knows the name of anybody else. I think that's not healthy for any organization. The organization should be showcasing its talent and giving them some, autonomy in terms of running different businesses, and that's really part of how you groom these folks. Also there's also an argument of maybe we should have more executives who are on the board. It used to be, like that, like 30 years ago, boards had a number of executives other than the CEO on the board. That all changed with Sarbanes-Oxley, where people got this idea that the board should be only composed of independent directors other than the CEO. But many people think that you lose something there, and there's a lot to be said for having more executives on the board, and the board becomes possibly more in touch with what's going on, other than otherwise you just have this one person, the CEO, who's basically there just to preserve their job, explaining everything to the board. And so they might get a more balanced view if you had more executives on the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. Can you give us, whether we've mentioned it already or not, kind of 3 key takeaways around board structure, and not necessarily structure, around how the board the significance of the board to the health of a company?
Yeah, I would say that, these days the board there's high expectations on the board, and it's going to be from everything from things that the board thinks are relevant and should be under their purview, and things that are not. Things that they know a lot about, and things that they just have no expertise in. So the value of the board there, it's if the for the board, I think part of the value is they have to know that their reputations are on the line, and that should incentivize them to do a better job. Don't just think of the legal standard. If you think of the legal standard, you're thinking of basically the lowest common denominator of what your job is supposed to be. And that's not, people should be aspiring to much more than that. I'd say that, today it also means that the board needs to be more proactive and take affirmative steps to get information that they might not otherwise get. Really pressure test and ask for access to the company's employees and job sites, etc., for them to get up to speed on what is going on in the company. The other thing I think for boards is that they should look for assistance. Boards right now, they rely on auditors on the financials. They rely on compensation consultants for executive compensation. There are other resources out there for them. If they need to get up to speed on cybersecurity or AI or crypto or whatever it is, there are people out there that can assist, that are independent from management. And I think independent sources of information, that's really a big part of what's lacking right now in terms of the board being able to get what they need to fulfill their fiduciary duties. But in terms of the value of the board, it's very hard to measure. It's hard to measure. Okay, what board adds the most value to the company? Who's a good director? And how do you look at the stock price while that person was on the board? I think these things are very, very hard to measure. But the value of the board is really keeping things in check and making sure people go through the right processes. I mean, corporate governance is a very process-oriented field, and a lot of it is making sure the right people are in the room before you make decisions, and those decisions are fully vetted. And if you do that, you have a better chance of good outcomes. You're not going to always have a good outcome, because things in business often go wrong despite good intentions and knowledge. It's just the decision just ended up not working out. But you have the right people in the room, you have a better shot of turning out successfully.
Well, thanks, Doug, for your insights. If people wanted to learn more about what you do or connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, my website is soundboardgovernance.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Doug Chia, at Doug Chia, DOUGCHIA. And, anyone can feel free to contact me. Just want to have a conversation.
Well, sounds great. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you, Jenna.
And until next time, listeners, keep your organizations healthy.